Welcome back to another M&S tutoring video, and in this video we're going to be starting our first unit in grade 10 math, quadratic equations. In this video we're going to be learning how to factor all types of trinomials from the simple trinomials all the way to complex trinomials. So let's begin with the first step you always have to look at when factoring trinomials. The first step you have to look at is the common factor. Well, what is a common factor? A common factor is anything that is a factor of all the constants in the equation. For example, if you have an equation that states 3x squared plus 12x minus 15, you have to find a common factor between 3, which is the coefficient of x squared, a common factor of 12, as well as a common factor between negative 15, right? Most of you can already tell that the common factor between 3, 12, and negative 15 is, of course, 3. So what we're going to do is we're going to move the 3 outside the bracket. So we can also write it as 3 factored, or 3 bracket x squared plus 4x minus 5, right? And a good way to check is if you can expand this bracket by distributing the 3 to the x squared, to the 4x, and to the negative 5. If you get the equation above, then you have factored it correctly. So that's the first step to factor a trinomial. Well, what about the next step? How do you factor the next part of the equation? How do you factor, let's say in this case, x squared plus 4x minus 5, right? In this case, this is a simple trinomial, as the coefficient of x is 1, right? And a simple trinomial always factors out to be something in the form of x plus m factored x plus n, right? Since the coefficient of x is 1, when you distribute the x, it's only x squared, and the coefficient of x squared remains 1 all the time. So say for example you wanted to factor x squared minus 3x minus 4. Well, how would you go about factoring this? Well, the first thing you have to look at is if you're using this general equation when looking at a simple trinomial, you have to think of two numbers, let's say in this case m and n, that equal to b. Well, some of you may be asking, what is b? Well, b in this case, because this is the general form of a quadratic equation, this x squared minus 3x minus 4, b in this case is negative 3, right? As a is 1 in this case, and negative 4 is c, right? So what you have to look at, you have to find two numbers that equal to negative 3 in this case. So m plus n is equal to negative 3. And you also have to find two numbers that multiply together to get c. Well, we already established that c in this case is negative 4. So m times n is equal to negative 4, right? So we have to find two numbers that add to negative 3. So m plus n is equal to negative 3. And m times n, two numbers that multiply together to get negative 4. And after we find both the numbers m and n, we can simply just sub it back into this equation over here. So what are those two numbers and how do you find those? Well, a lot of people just use the guess and check method because it's a really simple when you have to factor simple trinomials. So let's use that method. It says that we have to find two numbers that multiply to get negative 4. Well, those two numbers could be what? Well, they could be, well, we know that both the numbers one number has to be positive and one number has to be negative. So we know that the numbers can be negative 4 times 1, right? It could also be negative 2 times 2, right? It could also be negative 1 times 4. And the same way, it could also be 2 times negative 2, right? But which one would we use so that m plus n is equal to negative 3? Well, of course, if we add -4 plus 1, we get -3. So we know that m and n have to be -4 and 1, right? And it doesn't really matter in this case if you have m as -4 or n as -4, because either way, m plus n will be -3 and m times n will be -4. So this equation, this first equation factored, would be simply x minus 4, as we substituted m for -4, and x plus 1. And there we have it. The simple trinomial just got factored. So now let's move on to a complex trinomial. A complex trinomial is a trinomial in the quadratic form that has an x squared coefficient of anything other than 1, other than 0, of course. So if the equation is, let's say, 10x squared minus 13, let's say x minus 3, right? This would be considered a complex trinomial. Well, how do we factor this? Well, you factor it using a method called decomposition. Decomposition, the first step you always have to do is remove a common factor. Well, in this case, there is no common factor between 10, 13, and -3, of course. So we cannot do that step, or that step is considered already done because it's in the simplest form considering its common factor. The next step we have to do is we have to multiply a and c. Well, again, this is a, and the last variable, or the last constant, is c, right? We have to multiply a and c. So when we multiply a and c, of course, we get -30, right? Is equal to a times c, right? Now we have to find two numbers that have a product of -30. So m times n is equal to -30. And we have to use both those two numbers to replace the b term, or in this case, the middle term, which is b over here. So what two numbers have a product of -30? Well, we could say that -15 and 2 have a product of -30. So we can replace the middle term with -15. So we can replace this term over here with -15, -15x, and plus 2x. Notice that -15x plus 2x is also -13, but we write it as this so we can simplify it even further and we can factor it. So since we replace the middle term with that, we can write the equation as 10x squared minus 15x plus 2x minus 3. Now we have to work on simplifying or factoring it part by part. So we have one part over here, and we have another part over here. In this case, on the first part, part A, let's call it, we can see a common factor. We can see a common factor of 5. And if we simplify the part A, we get 5x factored 2x minus 3. And you have to remember that if there's nothing to factor the part B side, there's always 1. So we can have plus 1 outside the bracket and 2x minus 3 inside the bracket. And now, as the goal is to get 2x minus 3 inside both the brackets. And after 2x minus 3 is inside both the brackets, we can simply write 5x plus 1 factored 2x minus 3. And there we factorized the first equation given over here. So that's the decomposition method, and that's how you factor both simple trinomials and complex trinomials. The one thing you have to always remember is always remove the common factor, as it helps simplify the factoring process. So now let's move on to factoring the difference of squares. Well, what is a difference of squares? A difference of squares is when you have to factor something per se, let's say 4x squared minus 9. You notice how both of these terms are perfect squares. Well, how do I know they're perfect squares? Well, 4 is a perfect square, and 9 is also a perfect square, right? So what you have to do when you're factoring the difference of squares is all you have to do is you have to square root both terms. So we have to square root 4x squared, and we have to square root the second side. You have to remember that it always has to be a difference of squares. So that minus sign over there always has to be there. So when you want to factor a difference of squares, all you do is you square root the first term, which is 4x squared, which gives you simply 2x, and you have to square root the second term, which is 9. After you square root 9, of course, you get 3, and you have to simply write it as 2x minus 3 and 2x plus 3. And that is how you factor a difference of squares. It's actually really simple, because if you expand it, you'll notice that the middle term, which should have been there, which is not there, b, cancels out, because negative 6x and positive 6x cancel each other out, leaving us with only 4x squared and negative 9. So that's how you factor a difference of squares. Now let's move on to the last part of factoring, is factoring perfect squares. Well, what are perfect squares? Perfect squares are equations where it's actually a really profound concept here, where they have to be in the form of b is equal to the square root of c times the square root of a, and all of that times 2. This is the format of a perfect square equation. So I'll show you an example, because at start this is really confusing. So let's say I have 4c squared plus 12c plus 9. Notice how b in this case is 12, 4 in this case is a, and 9 in this case is c, right? Let's try and plug all these variables into this equation. And if this equation works, then we know that this given expression here is a perfect square equation. So if we plug b in for 12, c in for 9, and a in for 4, and multiply the whole thing by 2, we get, so in the bracket we have 3 times 2 and times 2 over here, and we get, without a doubt, 12 is equal to 12. So we know now that this equation over here is a perfect square expression, right? So now we can go on to factoring this perfect square equation. All you have to do to factor this equation is you have to square root the first term over here. So you have to square root 4c squared, and you have to square root the last equation over here. Sorry, the last term, which is term c in this case. So after you square root that, all you have to write is 2c plus 3. You have to combine both a and c and add a little square to it. This whole bracket squared. And that's how you factor perfect square equations. So that's the end of the video, guys. I hope you learned how to factor all different types of trinomials, all different types of difference of squares, perfect squares. If you have any comments or concerns, please feel free to leave it down in the comments below. And thanks for watching, guys.